The Mississippi River floodplain in southwestern Illinois contained one of the most productive environments in prehistoric North America. The region known as the American Bottom provided annual flooding that renewed soil fertility, diverse ecological zones within short distances, and access to continental trade routes. Between approximately 1050 and 1350 CE, this landscape supported Cahokia, a settlement whose population and monumental construction exceeded anything else north of Mesoamerica. Archaeologists estimate the city's peak population in the thousands or tens of thousands, though precise figures remain debated. The site's scale challenges assumptions about social complexity and urban development in pre-contact North America. Most physical evidence disappeared under modern agriculture and development before systematic excavation began. The American Bottom extends roughly 80 kilometers along the Mississippi River in southwestern Illinois, forming a floodplain between 6 and 15 kilometers wide. The river's annual flooding deposited nutrient-rich sediment across this lowland zone. Meander scars, oxbow lakes, and backwater sloughs created diverse aquatic habitats. Upland bluffs rose immediately east of the floodplain, providing access to different plant and animal resources. The confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers positioned the region at the intersection of major waterways connecting the Great Lakes, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Great Plains. The floodplain contained multiple ecological zones within walking distance. Bottomland hardwood forests grew along watercourses, dominated by oak, hickory, elm, and cottonwood. These forests provided nuts, wood for construction and fuel, and habitat for deer, turkey, and other game animals. Wetlands and marshes supported waterfowl, fish, freshwater mussels, and edible plants including lotus, cattail, and wild rice. Prairie vegetation appeared on elevated terraces and in openings, offering seeds from native grasses and herbaceous plants. This ecological diversity reduced subsistence risk and supported year-round occupation. The climate during the period of Cahokia's occupation fell within the medieval warm period, characterized by temperatures slightly warmer than preceding centuries. Growing seasons extended longer than in earlier periods, though regional climate variation remained significant. Flooding patterns influenced settlement locations and agricultural productivity. The floodplain's hydrology shifted over time as the river changed course and old channels filled with sediment. Natural levees along active channels provided elevated ground less prone to flooding, making these areas preferred for habitation and construction. The American Bottom's position within the continental interior placed it at the center of a vast river system. Canoes could travel north to the Great Lakes region, south to the Gulf coastal plain, west into the Missouri River drainage, and east via tributaries toward the Appalachian highlands. This accessibility facilitated movement of people, materials, and information across enormous distances. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, and stone from the Ozark Plateau all appear in archaeological contexts at Cahokia, demonstrating participation in exchange networks spanning much of eastern North America. The soils of the American Bottom consisted primarily of alluvial deposits with high organic content. These soils supported intensive agriculture without requiring long fallow periods. Maize, beans, and squash could be grown in the same fields across multiple seasons, though yields varied depending on flood timing and rainfall. The floodplain's productivity made it possible to generate agricultural surpluses capable of supporting non-food producing specialists and sustaining large, concentrated populations. However, this productivity also made the region attractive to competing groups and required coordination to manage resources effectively. Archaeological evidence indicates that the American Bottom had been occupied intermittently for thousands of years before Cahokia's emergence. Earlier populations had been smaller and more dispersed, utilizing the floodplain seasonally, or maintaining villages of limited size. The transition to large-scale urbanism required not only environmental conditions favorable to surplus production, but also social and political mechanisms capable of organizing labor, redistributing resources, and managing conflicts. The American bottom provided the environmental foundation, but human decisions and social structures determined how that foundation would be used. The river itself functioned as both resource and hazard. Annual flooding renewed soil fertility, but could destroy crops if timing proved unfavorable. The river provided fish, mussels, and transportation routes, but could shift course unpredictably, abandoning settlements or destroying built infrastructure. Communities managing these risks developed detailed knowledge of hydrological patterns, constructed settlements on elevated ground, and maintained flexibility in subsistence strategies. The scale of construction at Cahokia suggests that leaders successfully predicted or managed flooding well enough to commit enormous labor resources to monument building, rather than solely to subsistence activities. Vegetation patterns in the American bottom changed in response to human activity. Large-scale construction required timber for posts, roof supports, and palisade walls. Deforestation near major settlements altered local microclimates and may have increased erosion. Agricultural clearing converted forest and prairie to cultivated fields. Archaeological evidence of charcoal and changes in pollen profiles indicates extensive burning, both for land clearing and possibly for encouraging particular plant species. These modifications to the landscape reflected human control over the environment, but also created dependencies that made populations vulnerable to resource depletion or environmental change. The bluffs east of the floodplain contained chert outcrops and other lithic resources used for tool production. Quarries in these uplands provided raw material for projectile points, knives, scrapers, and hoes. The availability of workable stone within the immediate region reduced dependence on distant sources for everyday tools, though exotic materials still appeared in ritual and elite contexts. Clay deposits along the bluffs and floodplain margins supplied material for pottery production. Access to diverse raw materials within a compact area reduced logistical constraints and supported craft specialization. The American bottom's carrying capacity remains debated among archaeologists. Estimates depend on assumptions about agricultural productivity, the proportion of land under cultivation, and whether populations relied primarily on maize or maintained more diverse subsistence strategies. Some researchers suggest the floodplain could have supported populations in the tens of thousands if cultivation intensified and wild resources supplemented crops. Others argue that soil depletion, flooding variability, and competition for resources would have limited sustainable population levels. The absence of comprehensive settlement pattern data for the entire region complicates efforts to resolve these debates. What remains clear is that the environment provided sufficient resources to support a concentration of people unprecedented in the archaeological record of temperate North America. Populations in the American bottom before Cahokia's emergence lived in small, dispersed communities with limited evidence of social hierarchy. The early woodland period, beginning around 1000 BCE, saw groups construct small, conical burial mounds and produce cord-marked pottery. Settlements remained mobile or semi-sedentary, with subsistence focused on hunting, gathering, and cultivation of native seed crops including goosefoot, maygrass, and sumpweed. These communities participated in exchange networks that brought marine shell and exotic lithics into the region, but the scale of such exchanges remained modest compared to later periods. The Middle Woodland period, from approximately 200 BCE to 400 CE, witnessed increased mound construction and more elaborate burial practices. Groups in the American bottom participated in the Hopewell interaction sphere, a network of cultural practices and exchange relationships extending from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. Burial mounds from this period contain copper ornaments, mica sheets, obsidian blades, and marine shell beads, indicating access to materials from distant sources. However, settlements remained relatively small, and evidence suggests populations maintained seasonal mobility rather than year-round occupation of single locations. The Late Woodland period, from approximately 400 to 800 CE, marked a transition toward more permanent settlements and increased reliance on cultivated crops. Maize appeared in the archaeological record of the American Bottom during this period, though it initially served as a supplementary food rather than a dietary staple. Bow and arrow technology replaced the atlatl, changing hunting strategies and potentially influencing warfare patterns. Pottery styles became more diverse and regional, suggesting reduced participation in continent-wide exchange networks compared to the Middle Woodland. Villages grew larger, and some communities began constructing platform mounds rather than exclusively conical burial mounds. The emergent Mississippian period, from approximately 800 to 1050 CE, immediately preceded Cahokia's rapid expansion. During these centuries, communities in the American Bottom intensified maize agriculture and constructed increasingly substantial earthen mounds. The site of Cahokia existed during this period, but remained one settlement among several in the region, not yet demonstrating the population concentration or monumental architecture that would characterize its later development. Evidence indicates that multiple competing centers existed in the American Bottom, each with platform mounds and associated residential areas. Archaeological excavations at sites predating Cahokia's peak reveal gradual changes in social organization. Burials show increasing variation in grave goods, suggesting emerging social differentiation. Some individuals received elaborate interments with large quantities of exotic materials, while others were buried with minimal or no accompanying objects. This pattern contrasts with earlier periods when burial practices showed less variation. The appearance of prestige goods in certain graves indicates that some individuals or lineages accumulated wealth or status, though the mechanisms by which this occurred remain debated. Platform mounds constructed during the emergent Mississippian served as foundations for buildings rather than burial monuments. These structures required coordinated labor for their construction and suggest that communities could mobilize workers for large-scale projects. The mounds varied in size, with the largest reaching several meters in height and supporting structures interpreted as elite residences or public buildings. The concentration of exotic materials and specialized artifacts near these mounds indicates that they functioned as focal points for social and possibly ceremonial activities. Residential patterns during the emergent Mississippian show increasing nucleation. Earlier, late woodland settlements had been dispersed across the landscape, but communities began clustering into larger villages during the 9th and 10th centuries. Archaeological surveys reveal that some smaller sites were abandoned, while others grew substantially. This concentration of population created new challenges for waste disposal, resource management, and social coordination. The archaeological record contains evidence of increased storage capacity in the form of underground pits, suggesting that communities accumulated surpluses beyond immediate consumption needs. Pottery production during the emergent Mississippian became more standardized. Vessel forms included jars for storage and cooking, bowls for serving, and bottles likely used for liquids. Surface treatments shifted away from cord marking toward plain or smoothed finishes. Some vessels received incised or engraved decorations, though elaborate decoration remained relatively uncommon. The standardization of pottery forms and production techniques suggests increasing craft specialization, though evidence indicates that most households continued to produce their own ceramics rather than obtaining them through specialized producers. Subsistence strategies during this period combined maize agriculture with continued exploitation of wild resources. Remains of deer, turkey, fish, and freshwater mussels appear in refuse deposits alongside charred maize kernels and other plant materials. The proportion of maize in the diet increased over time based on stable isotope analysis of human skeletal remains. However, wild foods continued to provide significant nutritional and caloric contributions. Nut harvesting, particularly of hickory, remained important for providing fats and proteins. The diversity of food sources reduced vulnerability to crop failures and provided flexibility in subsistence scheduling. Evidence of violence appears sporadically in the archaeological record of the emergent Mississippian. Some skeletal remains show trauma consistent with interpersonal violence, including projectile point wounds and skull fractures. A few sites contain palisade fortifications, suggesting that communities perceived threats requiring defensive architecture. The frequency and scale of violence during this period remain difficult to assess due to limited skeletal samples and the possibility that many conflicts left no archaeological trace. Whether violence increased during the emergent Mississippian or merely became more visible, archaeologically remains uncertain. Exchange networks during the emergent Mississippian brought materials from across the mid-continent into the American bottom. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast arrived in forms including whole shells and manufactured beads. Copper from the Great Lakes appeared as sheet metal and finished ornaments. Mill Creek chert from northwestern Illinois provided material for large bifacial hoes used in agriculture. The volume of exotic materials remained modest compared to later periods, but their presence demonstrates continued participation in long-distance exchange. Whether these materials moved through direct procurement, down-the-line trade, or centralized redistribution systems remains debated. The transition from the emergent Mississippian to the Mississippian period proper occurred around 1050 CE. This transition involved rapid changes in settlement patterns, mound construction, and population concentration. The mechanisms driving these changes remain among the most debated topics in North American archaeology. Some researchers emphasize environmental factors, including favorable climate conditions and increased agricultural productivity. Others focus on social and political innovations that allowed leaders to mobilize labor and integrate larger populations. Still others suggest that religious or ideological transformations provided new frameworks for social organization. The archaeological evidence supports elements of multiple explanations, and the transition likely resulted from interactions among environmental, social, and ideological factors rather than a single cause. The period between approximately 1050 and 1100 CE witnessed the transformation of Cahokia from one community among several into the dominant settlement in the American bottom. Population estimates for this period range from 10,000 to 20,000 people. Though some researchers propose lower or higher figures, the rapid concentration of population required substantial reorganization of subsistence, labor, and social relationships. Archaeological evidence indicates that people migrated into Cahokia from surrounding areas and possibly from more distant regions, abandoning smaller settlements in favor of the growing urban center. The initial phase of expansion involved massive earth-moving projects. Construction crews built platform mounds, leveled plazas, and erected palisade walls around portions of the settlement. The labor requirements for these projects exceeded anything documented in earlier periods of the American bottom's prehistory. Estimates suggest that construction of the major mounds required millions of cubic meters of earth, moved using baskets and other hand tools. The coordination necessary to organize such labor indicates centralized decision-making authority, though the specific political structures remain archaeologically invisible. Residential architecture during the expansion phase consisted primarily of single-family houses with pole and thatch construction. These structures left post-hole patterns in the ground that archaeologists can identify and map. Houses clustered into neighborhoods, separated by open spaces and earthen mounds. The layout suggests planned organization rather than organic growth, with structures aligned along common orientations and grouped in regular patterns. Some neighborhoods show evidence of craft specialization, with concentrations of particular artifact types or production debris indicating that residents engaged in specific economic activities. The construction of a massive palisade wall around the central portion of Cahokia occurred during the early expansion phase. This wall, built from large wooden posts set in individual holes or wall trenches, enclosed an area of approximately 85 hectares. The wall incorporated bastions spaced at regular intervals, features typically associated with defensive architecture. Some researchers interpret the palisade as evidence of warfare or the threat of attack. Others suggest it functioned to control access to the central precinct and reinforce social boundaries between elites and commoners. The wall was rebuilt multiple times, indicating sustained investment in its maintenance. Mound construction during the expansion phase followed standardized procedures. Workers excavated earth from designated borrow pits, creating depressions that later filled with water to form ponds. They transported this earth to mound locations and deposited it in basket-sized loads. The mounds rose in stages, with layers of different colored soils creating visible stratification. Some mounds received clay caps to prevent erosion and provide stable building platforms. The largest mounds required decades to complete, representing sustained commitments of labor across multiple generations or intensive efforts involving large workforces over shorter periods. Archaeological evidence indicates that Cahokia's expansion drew population from a wide area. Pottery styles from different regions appear in residential contexts, suggesting that migrants brought their own ceramic traditions. Burial practices also show diversity, with some interments following local American bottom customs, while others incorporate elements from surrounding regions. This diversity complicates efforts to characterize Cahokia as culturally homogeneous and suggests that the city incorporated people from different backgrounds, rather than expanding through purely local population growth. The reasons individuals chose to migrate to Cahokia remain speculative. Some may have sought opportunities for trade, craft production, or participation in ceremonial activities. Others might have relocated due to coercion or political pressure from expanding elites. Still others could have fled environmental degradation, resource depletion, or conflict in their home regions. The archaeological record cannot distinguish among these motivations, and multiple factors likely influence different individuals and groups. What remains clear is that the population concentration occurred rapidly enough to require coordinated planning and resource management. Subsistence during the expansion phase relied heavily on maize agriculture. Stable isotope analysis of human skeletal remains indicates that maize constituted a substantial portion of the diet, more so than in earlier periods. However, wild resources continued to provide important contributions. Deer remained the primary meat source, supplemented by turkey, fish, and other animals. Freshwater mussels appear in large quantities in refuse deposits. Nuts, particularly hickory, provided fats and calories. The intensification of maize agriculture allowed population concentration but did not eliminate dependence on diverse food sources. Agricultural practices during this period likely included field preparation through burning, planting in mounds or rows, and periodic weeding. Maize cultivation depleted soil nutrients, particularly nitrogen, requiring either field rotation or supplementation through companion planting with nitrogen-fixing crops like beans. The extent to which Cahokians practiced such techniques remains unknown. Some researchers suggest that the floodplain's annual sediment deposition renewed soil fertility sufficiently to support continuous cultivation without long fallow periods. Others argue that declining yields would have necessitated expansion into new fields or adoption of soil management strategies. Craft production intensified during the expansion phase. Specialized producers manufactured shell beads, copper ornaments, carved stone figures, and ceremonial objects. Production debris concentrated in specific neighborhoods suggests that craftspeople worked in designated areas rather than distributing production evenly across all residential zones. Some craft items required materials from distant sources, indicating that producers had access to exchange networks bringing exotic materials into the city. The concentration of finished prestige goods in elite contexts suggests that production served to create or reinforce status distinctions. Trade networks during the expansion phase brought materials from across eastern North America to Cahokia. Marine shell arrived from both the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic seaboard. Copper came from the Great Lakes region. Mica originated in the Appalachian Mountains. Lead ore came from southeastern Missouri. Obsidian, though rare, appeared from sources in the Rocky Mountains or Yellowstone region. The volume of exotic materials exceeded anything seen in earlier periods, and Cahokia served as a node redistributing these materials to communities throughout the Mississippi River Valley and beyond. The mechanisms of exchange remain debated. Some researchers propose that Cahokia's elites controlled long-distance trade and used access to exotic goods to reinforce their authority. Others suggest more decentralized exchange systems in which individual traders or communities participated independently. Still others argue for tribute relationships in which subordinate communities provided materials or finished goods to Cahokia's leaders. The archaeological evidence supports elements of each model, and exchange likely operated through multiple mechanisms simultaneously rather than a single centralized system. Religious or ceremonial activities during the expansion phase centered on the plazas and mounds of the central precinct. The alignment of some structures suggests attention to solar or lunar cycles, though interpretations of astronomical significance remain controversial. Large posts erected in circles, known from later periods at Cahokia, may have served as calendrical markers or ceremonial focal points. The concentration of elaborate burials and ceremonial objects near major mounds indicates that these locations held special significance, though the specific beliefs and practices remain archaeologically inaccessible beyond material correlates. Monk's Mound dominates the Cahokia site, rising approximately 30 meters above the surrounding floodplain. The structure covers more than 5 hectares at its base, making it the largest prehistoric earthen construction in North America. The mound consists of 4 terraces, with the largest forming the base and successively smaller platforms rising to the summit. Construction occurred in multiple stages over several decades or centuries, with different phases identifiable through soil stratigraphy and the presence of earlier structures buried within the mound's mass. The mound's orientation follows a north-south axis with slight deviation, a pattern repeated in other major structures at Cahokia. The summit terrace supported a large building, evidenced by patterns of post holes discovered during archaeological excavations. This structure measured approximately 30 meters long and 15 meters wide, substantially larger than typical residential buildings elsewhere at the site. The building's size and location suggest it served as an elite residence, a temple, or a building for public gatherings, though its specific function remains debated among researchers. Archaeological investigations of Monk's Mound have been limited by the structure's size and the challenges of excavating such a massive feature. Early excavations in the 1960s and 1970s revealed the staged construction and the presence of buildings on the summit and intermediate terraces. Subsequent work documented slumping and erosion on the mound's western face, where modern highway construction destabilized portions of the structure. Core samples and limited excavations provide information about construction techniques, but large portions of the mound remain unexplored. The full sequence of building episodes and modifications thus remains incompletely understood. The labor required to construct Monk's Mound has been estimated based on experimental archaeology and calculations of earth volume. Estimates suggest that millions of basketloads of soil were transported to the mound location. If workers moved earth continuously, construction might have required decades. If labor occurred seasonally, when agricultural demands were reduced, the timeline could extend to a century or more. The coordination necessary to organize such labor over extended periods indicates sustained political authority capable of mobilizing workers and managing construction projects across multiple generations. The central precinct surrounding Monk's Mound contained approximately 17 additional mounds arranged around a large plaza. This plaza, known as the Grand Plaza, measured roughly 20 hectares and provided open space for gatherings, ceremonies, or communal activities. The surface of the plaza shows evidence of preparation and maintenance, including the deposition of clay and sand to create a level surface. The effort invested in maintaining this open space suggests it served important social or ceremonial functions rather than simply representing empty ground between structures. 4 large platform mounds stood at the corners of the Grand Plaza, creating a roughly rectangular arrangement. These mounds varied in size, but each rose several meters above the plaza surface. Archaeological evidence indicates that buildings stood atop these platforms, though the structure's purposes remain uncertain. Some researchers suggest they served as residences for elites or important lineages. Others propose they functioned as temples or buildings for specific ceremonial activities. The lack of extensive excavation limits interpretation, and multiple functions may have coexisted or changed over time. South of Monk's Mound, a series of smaller mounds formed additional plaza spaces and architectural groups. These areas contained concentrations of high-status residences, craft production areas, and specialized buildings. The organization of space in these zones suggests hierarchical planning, with larger mounds and more elaborate structures occupying central positions. The distribution of exotic artifacts and prestige goods shows higher concentrations near major mounds, supporting interpretations that these areas housed elites or served as focal points for ritual and political activities. A wooden post circle once stood in the plaza west of Monk's Mound. This feature, reconstructed based on archaeological evidence of post holes, consisted of tall wooden posts arranged in a circle approximately 125 meters in diameter. The posts aligned with specific solar positions, leading researchers to interpret the feature as a calendrical device or solar observatory. The structure has been termed Woodhenge, drawing comparison to the Prehistoric monument in England, though the structures differ substantially in construction and cultural context. Multiple post circles were built and rebuilt in this location, indicating sustained attention to this feature over time. The central precinct was enclosed by a palisade wall, separating it from outer residential and craft production areas. This wall restricted access to the core of the settlement, creating physical and symbolic boundaries between the elite center and the broader population. Passages through the wall allowed controlled entry, suggesting that movement into the central precinct was regulated. The maintenance of this boundary over multiple wall rebuilding episodes indicates that spatial segregation remained important to Cahokia's social organization throughout much of its occupation. Excavations in the central precinct have revealed dense concentrations of artifacts associated with elite activities and specialized production. Marine shell beads, copper ornaments, carved stone figures, and elaborate pottery appear more frequently in this area than in outer neighborhoods. Production debris indicates that craftspeople manufactured these items within or near the elite center, possibly under the patronage or direct control of high-status individuals. The concentration of both production and consumption of prestige goods in the central precinct supports models emphasizing centralized control over valuable resources and specialized labor. Burial mounds within the central precinct contained individuals interred with extraordinary quantities of grave goods. The most famous of these, Mound 72, held multiple mass burials and high-status interments. One central burial included a man positioned on a platform of shell beads, numbering in the thousands. Surrounding burials contained additional individuals, some with grave goods, and others apparently sacrificed to accompany the central figure. The scale and elaboration of these burials far exceeded typical mortuary practices, indicating extreme social differentiation and possibly institutionalized inequality. The central precinct's layout suggests careful planning and sustained maintenance. The alignment of mounds, the preparation of plaza surfaces, and the rebuilding of palisades all required ongoing labor investment. This sustained effort indicates that Cahokia's leaders could command labor not only for initial construction projects, but also for continued maintenance and modification. The ability to mobilize labor repeatedly over extended periods demonstrates political authority of a different magnitude than earlier communities in the region had achieved. The relationship between Monk's Mound and surrounding structures created visual hierarchies visible from throughout the settlement. The mound's height made it a landmark visible for kilometers across the flat floodplain. Structures on its summit would have been visible from the plazas below, creating a symbolic connection between elite spaces and public gathering areas. This visibility may have served to reinforce social hierarchies, remind residents of centralized authority, or facilitate ceremonial performances witnessed by large audiences. Archaeological evidence from the central precinct remains incomplete despite more than a century of investigation. Many mounds have been damaged or destroyed by modern development. Others remain unexcavated, their contents and construction sequences unknown. The Grand Plaza lies partially beneath modern roads and agricultural fields. Comprehensive understanding of the central precinct's full extent, organization, and evolution thus remains limited. What is clear from existing evidence is that this core area represented a concentration of political, ceremonial, and economic activity unmatched elsewhere in prehistoric eastern North America. Maize agriculture formed the foundation of Cahokia's subsistence economy during its peak occupation. Analysis of plant remains from archaeological contexts shows that maize constituted the primary cultivated crop, appearing in storage pits, refuse deposits, and as charred kernels in domestic hearths. The variety grown at Cahokia was Eastern 8-row, a type adapted to the growing conditions of the mid-continent. Fields extended across the American bottom floodplain, with cultivation likely concentrated on natural levees and other elevated areas less prone to catastrophic flooding. Bean cultivation supplemented maize production, though direct archaeological evidence for beans at Cahokia remains limited compared to maize. Beans fix nitrogen in soil, potentially allowing sustained cultivation without long fallow periods. The combination of maize and beans provided complementary proteins and improved nutritional outcomes compared to reliance on maize alone. Squash also appeared in the agricultural repertoire, with seeds and rind fragments recovered from archaeological deposits. These three crops, often referred to as the Eastern Agricultural Complex when combined with native cultigens, formed the core of Cahokian farming. Native seed crops, including goosefoot, maygrass, knotweed, and sumpweed, continued to be cultivated or encouraged alongside maize-based agriculture. These plants had been domesticated in eastern North America thousands of years before maize arrived from Mesoamerica. Their seeds provided carbohydrates and could be stored for extended periods. Some of these crops tolerated marginal soils or different moisture conditions than maize. potentially serving as backup foods during years when maize harvests failed. The continued use of native crops alongside maize demonstrates agricultural diversity rather than complete replacement of earlier subsistence strategies. Wild plant foods remained important despite agricultural intensification. Hickory nuts appear abundantly in refuse deposits and provided concentrated fats and calories. Acorns, walnuts, and hazelnuts supplemented hickory. These nut crops required processing to remove shells and, in the case of acorns, to leach out bitter tannins. The labor investment in nut collection and processing suggests they provided nutritional returns worth the effort. Nut harvests varied from year to year, depending on weather conditions. Creating uncertainty that required storage or alternative food sources during poor mast years, hunting provided meat protein, with white-tailed deer serving as the primary game animal. Deer bones dominate faunal assemblages from residential areas, appearing as butchered remains with cut marks from stone tools. Hunters likely used bows and arrows, the dominant projectile technology during Cahokia's occupation. Turkey bones also appear frequently, suggesting that these birds were hunted or possibly maintained in semi-domestic conditions. Smaller mammals, including raccoon, rabbit, and squirrel, contributed to the diet, though in lesser quantities than deer. Fishing supplemented terrestrial hunting. The Mississippi River and associated waterways provided catfish, gar, drum, and other species. Fish bones appear in archaeological deposits, though their frequency varies across different areas of the site. Fishing technology likely included nets, weirs, hooks, and spears. Seasonal spawning runs may have provided opportunities for intensive fish harvests. The contribution of fish to overall diet remains difficult to quantify due to preservation biases that favor larger mammal bones over smaller, more fragile fish remains. Freshwater mussels appear in enormous quantities in refuse deposits at Cahokia. Shell middens contain millions of individual shells representing multiple species harvested from the Mississippi River and its tributaries. Mussels provided protein with minimal investment of labor beyond collection and processing. However, mussel populations can be depleted by overharvesting, and evidence suggests that exploitation intensified over time as preferred species became scarcer. The shift in species composition within shell middens may indicate resource depression resulting from sustained intensive harvesting. Food storage required substantial infrastructure. Underground pits lined with grass or bark provided cool, dry conditions for storing maize, nuts, and dried meat. Hundreds of these storage pits have been identified through archaeological excavation, though many more likely existed. The capacity of these pits indicates that households accumulated surpluses beyond immediate consumption needs. Whether these surpluses served as insurance against harvest failures, supported non-food producing specialists, or were extracted as tribute to elites remains debated. Multiple functions likely coexisted. Food processing required specialized tools and facilities. Grinding stones, including manos and metates, processed maize into flour. The ubiquity of these tools in residential contexts indicates that grinding occurred at the household level rather than in centralized processing facilities. The labor intensity of grinding maize by hand was substantial, with experimental studies suggesting that producing sufficient flour for daily consumption required hours of work. This labor burden fell primarily on women, based on skeletal evidence of repetitive stress injuries consistent with grinding activities. Large-scale cooking facilities included earth ovens and communal hearths. Some features interpreted as earth ovens contained fire-cracked rock, charred plant remains, and evidence of high-temperature heating. These facilities could roast large quantities of food simultaneously, potentially for communal feasting or food preparation during ceremonial gatherings. The investment in constructing and maintaining such features suggests that food preparation sometimes occurred at scales beyond individual household needs. Trade networks brought exotic foods and materials into Cahokia, though the volume of imported foodstuffs remains uncertain. Marine shell arrived from the Gulf Coast, but whether dried fish or other preserved foods accompanied shell cargoes cannot be determined archaeologically. Salt may have been imported from sources in southern Illinois or elsewhere, though direct evidence is limited. The movement of food across long distances would have been constrained by preservation challenges and transportation costs, likely limiting such exchanges to highly valued or easily preserved items. Cahokia's position within regional exchange networks made it a redistribution center for goods moving across eastern North America. Marine shell beads manufactured at Cahokia have been found at sites hundreds of kilometers away, indicating that the city exported finished goods. Copper artifacts, exotic lithics, and other materials from distant sources appear at Cahokia in quantities suggesting centralized accumulation and subsequent redistribution. Whether this exchange operated through market mechanisms, tribute relationships, gift exchange, or combinations of these systems remains debated. Craft production at Cahokia included specialists who manufactured prestige goods for local elites and for export. Shell bead production left debris, including broken shells, manufacturing waste, and partially finished beads. The concentration of this debris in specific areas suggests that production occurred in workshops rather than being dispersed across all households. Similar concentrations of copperworking debris, stone tool manufacturing waste, and pottery production areas indicate spatial segregation of craft activities, though the degree of specialization and whether craftspeople worked full-time or part-time remains uncertain. The organization of labor at Cahokia required coordination beyond the household level. Agricultural work, mound construction, palisade building, and craft production all demanded scheduling, resource allocation, and management. Some researchers propose that Cahokia's leaders controlled labor through coercion or institutionalized authority. Others suggest that communal labor was organized through kinship obligations, ceremonial sodalities, or voluntary cooperation. The archaeological evidence cannot distinguish definitively among these models, and labor organization may have varied depending on the task and social context. Economic inequality appears in the differential distribution of goods and access to resources. Elite residences near major mounds contained higher frequencies of exotic materials and prestige goods than houses in peripheral neighborhoods. Some individuals received elaborate burials with thousands of shell beads, copper ornaments, and other valuables, while others were interred with minimal or no grave goods. This variation indicates that wealth or status was not equally distributed, though the mechanisms that generated and maintained inequality remain subjects of ongoing research and debate among archaeologists studying Cahokia. Stone tool production at Cahokia utilized both local and imported lithic materials. Mill Creek chert from northwestern Illinois arrived as large nodules or partially worked blanks and was manufactured into massive bifacial hoes used for agricultural field preparation. These hoes, some measuring over 30 centimeters in length, required skilled flaking to produce symmetrical, thin bifaces capable of withstanding the stresses of digging and chopping. Production debris from Mill Creek chert appears concentrated in specific areas, suggesting that specialized knappers manufactured these tools rather than production occurring in every household. Projectile points during Cahokia's occupation were small triangular forms designed for arrow tips rather than the larger points used with atlatls in earlier periods. These points were manufactured from locally available cherts and other fine-grained stone materials. The standardization of point forms across the site and throughout the greater Mississippian world suggests shared technological traditions and possibly centralized production or strict stylistic conventions. Points appear in residential contexts, burial contexts, and occasionally embedded in human skeletal remains, indicating their use in both hunting and interpersonal violence. Groundstone tools including celts, axes, and adzes were manufactured through pecking and grinding, rather than flaking. These tools served for woodworking, including felling trees, shaping timbers, and carving posts. The scale of construction at Cahokia required enormous quantities of wood for building posts, palisade walls, and roof structures. The production and maintenance of groundstone woodworking tools thus represented a significant investment of labor. Many celts show evidence of resharpening through repeated grinding, indicating that tools were maintained and used until exhausted rather than discarded after minimal use. Grinding implements for food processing appear ubiquitously in residential areas. Manos and metates for processing maize show characteristic wear patterns from repeated back-and-forth grinding motions. Some grinding stones were manufactured from local sandstone, while others were made from granite or other igneous rocks that may have been imported from regions beyond the immediate American bottom. The presence of worn-out grinding stones in refuse deposits indicates that these tools had finite use lives and required replacement, creating sustained demand for new implements. Pottery production at Cahokia followed Mississippian traditions widespread across the mid-continent. Vessels were constructed using coil and scrape techniques, with clay coils stacked and then smoothed to create vessel walls. Surface treatments included plain surfaces, smoothing, and occasional decoration through incising or punctation. Vessel forms included jars for cooking and storage, bowls for serving, and bottles with restricted necks likely used for liquids. Some vessels received red or black slips, though elaborate painted decoration characteristic of some other regions remained rare at Cahokia. Ceramic production likely occurred at the household level, with most families manufacturing their own utilitarian vessels. However, some pottery shows higher levels of craftsmanship and standardization, possibly indicating specialized production for elite consumption or ceremonial use. Temper materials added to clay to prevent cracking during firing included crushed shell, a practice that became standard during the Mississippian period. The use of shell temper required access to freshwater mussel shells, linking pottery production to the exploitation of riverine resources. Stone figurines carved from locally available materials depicted human forms and occasionally animals. These objects, often small enough to hold in one hand, show careful attention to anatomical detail and sometimes include representations of clothing, ornaments, or ritual paraphernalia. The figurines appear in both elite and non-elite contexts, though their specific functions remain debated. Some researchers interpret them as ritual objects, while others suggest they served as gaming pieces, fertility symbols, or representations of ancestors or deities. Copper working at Cahokia involved cold hammering sheet copper into ornaments, ear spools, and other objects. Native copper from the Great Lakes region arrived as nuggets or partially worked pieces and was shaped through repeated hammering and annealing. The malleability of copper allowed artisans to create thin sheets that could be cut and shaped into elaborate forms. Copper objects appear primarily in elite burial contexts and as offerings in specialized deposits, indicating that copper retained special significance beyond its material properties. Marine shellworking produced beads, pendants, gorgets, and other ornaments. Shell arrived from the Gulf Coast as whole shells or partially worked pieces. Artisans cut, drilled, and shaped shell using stone tools and abrasives. Bead production generated substantial manufacturing debris, including broken shell fragments and drilling waste. The concentration of this debris in specific workshop areas suggests that shell working was spatially segregated from other activities. Finished shell beads served as prestige goods, burial offerings, and possibly as currency or stored wealth. Basketry and cordage production left minimal archaeological traces due to organic material decomposition. Impressions on pottery surfaces and occasional preserved fragments indicate that baskets were manufactured from plant fibers and used for storage and transport. The transport of millions of basket loads of earth during mound construction required enormous numbers of baskets, suggesting that basket production represented a significant component of Cahokia's craft economy. Cordage for binding, nets, and other purposes was likely manufactured from plant fibers, including nettle and dogbane. Woodworking produced posts, planks, and carved objects. The construction of buildings required straight posts set in the ground to support walls and roofs. Palisade walls required thousands of large posts set at regular intervals. The production of these structural elements demanded forest clearance, timber transport, and shaping of wood into appropriate forms. Specialized buildings on mound tops may have required more elaborate carpentry, including joinery techniques, though direct evidence for such construction methods remains limited due to poor preservation of wooden elements. Textile production likely occurred, though direct evidence remains scarce. Preserved fabric fragments from dry cave contexts elsewhere in eastern North America demonstrate that weaving technology existed during the Mississippian period. Spindle whorls and other tools associated with fiber processing appear occasionally in archaeological contexts at Cahokia. Clothing probably included woven fabrics, though hide garments from deer and other animals also served as clothing materials. The specific techniques, patterns, and styles of textile production remain archaeologically invisible. Boat construction enabled transport across rivers and movement along waterways. While no complete boats have been recovered from Cahokia, the site's position on major rivers and evidence of long-distance exchange imply that watercraft were essential technologies. Dugout canoes manufactured from single logs provided the most likely vessel form, based on ethnographic accounts and archaeological finds from other regions. The construction of large dugout canoes required suitable trees, woodworking tools, and controlled burning to hollow vessel interiors. Tools for plant processing included digging sticks for root collection and specialized implements for harvesting and processing specific plant materials. Archaeological evidence for such tools remains limited because wooden implements rarely preserve. However, the intensive use of plant resources implies that specialized tools existed. Seed processing may have involved specialized containers, winnowing baskets, or other equipment that left no durable archaeological signature. The cumulative technological repertoire at Cahokia represented knowledge accumulated over generations and transmitted through apprenticeship and observation. The production of complex artifacts, including large bifacial hoes, elaborately carved stone figures, and precisely manufactured shell beads, required years of training to master. The presence of manufacturing errors and partially finished objects in archaeological contexts provides evidence of learning and skill acquisition. The concentration of specialized production in specific areas suggests that master craftspeople worked in proximity to apprentices, facilitating knowledge transmission. Technological innovations during Cahokia's occupation appear limited compared to the scale of social and political changes. Most technologies employed at Cahokia had precedence in earlier Mississippian or late woodland contexts. The bow and arrow, shell-tempered pottery, and maize agriculture all predated Cahokia's emergence. What changed was not the invention of new technologies, but rather the scale and intensity of their application. The mobilization of labor for massive construction projects and the organization of specialized craft production represented social innovations more than technological ones. The transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene occurred approximately 11,000 years before Cahokia's emergence, ending the last glacial period. However, climate continued to vary throughout the Holocene, with cycles of warming and cooling influencing environments across North America. The medieval warm period, spanning roughly from 900 to 1300 CE, coincided with Cahokia's rise and florescence. During this interval, temperatures averaged slightly warmer than preceding centuries, and growing seasons lengthened across the mid-continent. These conditions favored agricultural intensification and supported larger populations in regions dependent on maize cultivation. The medieval warm period exhibited regional variation rather than uniform warming across the continent. Some areas experienced increased precipitation, while others became drier. The Mississippi River Valley generally received adequate rainfall for agriculture during much of this period, though year-to-year variability remained significant. Droughts occurred episodically, creating temporary subsistence stress. Flooding patterns also varied, with some periods showing more frequent or severe floods than others. Communities adapted to this variability through storage, diversified subsistence strategies, and settlement location choices. Tree ring records from the broader mid-continent region provide evidence of precipitation patterns during Cahokia's occupation. These records show periods of above-average rainfall alternating with droughts of varying duration and severity. A significant drought occurred during the mid-12th century, potentially coinciding with changes in Cahokia's settlement patterns and population. However, linking specific climate events to archaeological changes remains challenging due to dating uncertainties and the difficulty of determining whether climate shifts caused social responses or merely coincided with them. The end of the medieval warm period and transition into cooler conditions of the Little Ice Age began around 1300 CE, after Cahokia's peak, but during its decline phase. Cooler temperatures shortened growing seasons and reduced agricultural productivity in marginal areas. The American Bottom's relatively southern latitude provided some buffer against these changes compared to regions farther north, but even modest temperature declines could have affected harvest reliability. Whether climate deterioration contributed to Cahokia's decline remains debated, with some researchers emphasizing environmental factors and others focusing on social and political causes. River behavior changed in response to climate variations and possibly human landscape modifications. The Mississippi River's course shifted over time as channels filled with sediment and new channels formed. These shifts affected settlement locations, agricultural field access, and transportation routes. Major channel changes could render previously favorable settlement locations less desirable or expose formerly protected areas to flooding. Archaeological evidence shows that some portions of Cahokia were abandoned while others continued to be occupied, possibly reflecting responses to changing hydrological conditions. Deforestation around Cahokia altered local environmental conditions. The removal of trees for construction, fuel, and agricultural clearing reduced forest cover across portions of the American Bottom. Deforestation increased soil erosion, potentially degrading agricultural land and increasing sediment loads in streams. Changes in vegetation also affected local climate through altered evapotranspiration and surface albedo, though the magnitude of such effects at the scale of the American Bottom remains difficult to assess. Pollen records show shifts in vegetation composition during Cahokia's occupation, indicating human-induced landscape transformation. Soil degradation may have resulted from intensive agriculture and erosion. Continuous maize cultivation without adequate fallow periods or nutrient inputs depleted soil fertility over time. Erosion from cleared fields transported topsoil into waterways, reducing field productivity and potentially affecting aquatic ecosystems. Archaeological evidence of decreasing settlement density in some agricultural areas during later periods may reflect declining soil quality, though alternative explanations including political reorganization or conflict also exist. Resource depletion affected multiple components of Cahokia's subsistence economy. Deer populations may have declined due to overhunting, requiring hunters to travel greater distances or shift to alternative prey species. Mussel beds in nearby streams showed evidence of exploitation pressure, with shifts toward smaller individuals and less preferred species. Nut-producing trees may have been cleared for agriculture, reducing wild plant food availability. The cumulative effects of resource depletion could have undermined subsistence security and required either technological innovation, territorial expansion, or population reduction. Flooding remained a persistent hazard throughout Cahokia's occupation. The Mississippi River's annual flood cycle was predictable in timing, but variable in magnitude. Extreme floods could destroy crops, damage structures, and force temporary relocations. The construction of mounds and settlement on elevated natural levees provided some protection, but catastrophic floods could still affect large areas. Archaeological evidence of rebuilding and mound expansion may partly reflect recovery from flood damage, though distinguishing flood-related reconstruction from other building episodes remains difficult. Climate variability created agricultural risk that required management strategies. Storage of surplus maize and other foods provided insurance against poor harvest years. Diversification of food sources reduced dependence on any single crop or resource. Exchange networks allowed communities to obtain foods from regions experiencing better conditions during local shortfalls. These strategies buffered against year-to-year variability, but required coordination and planning. The breakdown of any of these buffering mechanisms could have rendered populations vulnerable to subsistence crises. Paleo-environmental reconstructions based on pollen cores, sediment analyses, and other proxies show that the American bottom's environment changed substantially during Cahokia's occupation. Forest composition shifted as certain tree species became less abundant while others increased. Wetland areas expanded or contracted in response to changing river behavior. Open areas increased due to agricultural clearing and settlement expansion. These changes created a landscape increasingly modified by human activity rather than solely by natural processes. The relationship between climate change and social change remains one of the most debated topics in Cahokia archaeology. Environmental determinists argue that climate deterioration and resource depletion forced Cahokia's abandonment. Critics of this perspective note that human societies possess adaptive capacities that allow responses to environmental challenges through technological, social, or political innovations. The archaeological evidence suggests that environmental changes created stresses that Cahokian society managed for extended periods before ultimately declining, indicating that social and political factors mediated environmental influences rather than climate directly determining outcomes. Comparison with other Mississippian centers shows varied responses to similar climatic conditions. Some sites continued to be occupied or even expanded during periods when Cahokia declined. Others were abandoned earlier or showed different trajectories of growth and contraction. This variation suggests that local factors including social organization, political stability, and resource availability influenced how communities experienced and responded to broader environmental changes. Climate created constraints and opportunities, but human choices and social structures determined specific outcomes. The medieval warm period's end did not cause immediate or universal collapse of Mississippian societies. Many centers persisted into the 14th and 15th centuries, adapting to changing conditions through agricultural adjustments, settlement relocations, or social reorganization. Cahokia's decline occurred during the transition period between the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. positioning climate change as one potential contributing factor among several. The precise mechanisms linking climate to social change remain difficult to identify archaeologically, requiring researchers to rely on correlations and inferences rather than direct evidence of causation. Burial practices at Cahokia provide the most direct evidence for social differentiation and hierarchy. The majority of burials excavated archaeologically show simple interments with minimal grave goods. Individuals were placed in pits, sometimes within or near residential areas, other times in designated cemetery areas. These burials typically contained no objects, or only a few utilitarian items such as pottery vessels or shell beads. The simplicity of most burials contrasts sharply with the elaborate interments found in mound contexts, indicating marked inequality in mortuary treatment. Mound 72, located south of Monk's Mound, contained extraordinary burial features discovered during excavations in the 1960s and 1970s. The central feature included a male individual approximately 45 years old, positioned on a platform constructed from more than 20,000 shell beads. This burial, designated Burial 260, represents one of the most elaborate interments documented in prehistoric eastern North America. The quantity of shell beads alone indicates enormous expenditure of labor and resources, as each bead required drilling and shaping from marine shell transported hundreds of kilometers from the Gulf Coast. Surrounding the central burial in Mound 72 were multiple mass graves containing individuals deposited without the care typical of normative burials. One feature held the remains of 53 young women, most between 15 and 25 years old, arranged in rows. Another contained 4 men with heads and hands removed, suggesting execution. Additional features held groups of individuals showing evidence of violent death. The totality of burials in Mound 72 exceeded 270 individuals, far exceeding typical mortuary mounds. Interpretations of these mass burials range from human sacrifice accompanying an elite individual to the interment of captives or victims of epidemic disease. The elaborate burial assemblage in Mound 72 included materials beyond the shell bead platform. Mica sheets from the Appalachian Mountains, copper objects, projectile points manufactured from exotic lithics, and carved shell items accompanied the central individual. The geographic origins of these materials span eastern North America, demonstrating the deceased individual's access to long-distance exchange networks or the willingness of survivors to invest extraordinary resources in mortuary ritual. Whether the individual achieved high status through personal accomplishment, inherited position, or religious authority cannot be determined from burial goods alone. Elite burials elsewhere at Cahokia show similar patterns of differential treatment, though rarely matching the scale of Mound 72. Some mounds contained single or multiple burials, with moderate quantities of grave goods, including pottery, shell beads, copper ornaments, and stone tools. These burials suggest a hierarchy of status, with the Mound 72 individual at the apex, intermediate elites receiving substantial but less extreme mortuary treatment, and commoners buried with minimal or no grave goods. The archaeological sample remains limited, as many mounds were destroyed before systematic excavation, and others remain unexcavated. Residential patterns provide additional evidence for social stratification. Structures located near major mounds, particularly in the central precinct, show evidence of higher quality construction and greater access to exotic materials. Post patterns indicate that some buildings were substantially larger than typical houses, possibly serving as elite residences or specialized buildings. The distribution of artifacts shows higher frequencies of prestige goods near mounds, suggesting that proximity to ritual or political centers correlated with wealth or status. However, the relationship between residence location and social position remains incompletely documented due to limited excavation of residential areas. Evidence of specialized labor appears in the concentration of craft production debris in specific areas. Shell bead manufacturing, copperworking, and production of elaborate stone tools occurred in designated locations rather than uniformly across all residential zones. Whether craft specialists worked full-time at their trades or combined production with agricultural labor remains uncertain. The scale of production, particularly for items requiring exotic raw materials, suggests some degree of controlled access to resources and possibly attached specialists working under elite patronage. Skeletal evidence provides information about health, nutrition, and labor patterns that correlate with social status. Analysis of bone chemistry through stable isotope studies shows that some individuals consumed more maize than others, potentially indicating differential access to stored foods or agricultural surpluses. Skeletal stress markers, including enamel hypoplasias and growth disruptions, appear more frequently in some burial populations than others, suggesting variable experiences of childhood nutrition and health. Patterns of degenerative joint disease and trauma also vary, potentially reflecting different labor activities or exposure to violence. The presence of individuals with physical disabilities in burial contexts raises questions about social treatment of non-productive members. Some burials contain individuals with conditions that would have limited their ability to perform typical labor tasks. Their inclusion in formal burial grounds suggests they remained integrated into communities rather than being excluded or marginalized. However, the treatment of disabled individuals in terms of grave goods and burial location shows variation, complicating efforts to characterize social attitudes archaeologically. Gender differentiation appears in burial practices and material culture. Some burial goods show associations with specific sexes based on skeletal analysis. For example, certain projectile point types or tool forms appear more frequently with male skeletons, while specific ornament types associate with female burials. However, these patterns show exceptions, indicating that gender roles were not absolutely rigid, or that some individuals occupied non-binary social positions. The archaeological visibility of gender remains limited to material correlates, leaving social constructions of gender largely inaccessible. Age at death influences burial treatment, with infants and children receiving different mortuary practices than adults. Infant mortality was high, as expected in pre-industrial populations without modern medical care. Many infant burials appear in or near houses, suggesting that residential areas served as burial grounds for very young individuals. Older children and adolescents received varied treatment, some buried with grave goods and others without. Whether age-related burial patterns reflect social status, cause of death, or other factors remains difficult to determine. Evidence of warfare or organized violence appears in multiple contexts. Palisade fortifications, violent trauma on skeletal remains, and possible mass graves suggest that conflict occurred during Cahokia's occupation. The scale and frequency of violence remain debated. Some researchers argue that warfare was endemic and significant, while others suggest that violence was episodic and limited in scope. The archaeological record cannot resolve questions about the causes of conflict, whether territorial expansion, resource competition, or political rivalry motivated violence. Leadership structures at Cahokia remain archaeologically invisible beyond inferences from differential burial treatment and settlement organization. Whether authority derived from religious roles, military prowess, control of exchange networks, kinship position, or combinations of these factors cannot be determined with certainty. The scale of labor mobilization for mound construction suggests that leaders commanded substantial authority, but whether this authority was coercive, consensual, or based on reciprocal obligations remains speculative. Ethnographic analogues provide possibilities, but cannot confirm specific organizational forms. The persistence of inequality across multiple generations remains uncertain. The presence of elaborate burials throughout Cahokia's occupation suggests that social stratification was not ephemeral. However, whether specific families or lineages maintained privileged positions across generations, or whether status was achieved in each generation, cannot be determined archaeologically. The absence of monumental residential architecture, comparable to palaces in other complex societies, limits inferences about hereditary elite classes. Social control mechanisms beyond leadership authority remain archaeologically invisible. Whether Cahokia possessed formal legal systems, police forces, or institutionalized punishment cannot be determined from material remains. The palisade walls could have functioned to control population movement and restrict access to elite areas, suggesting some form of social control beyond voluntary cooperation. However, the specific mechanisms and their effectiveness remain speculative. The relationship between religious authority and political power cannot be disentangled archaeologically. Major mounds likely served ceremonial functions in addition to any political roles. Control over ritual knowledge and performance may have provided basis for authority. The southeastern ceremonial complex iconography suggests shared religious frameworks across the Mississippian world, potentially indicating that religious specialists held significant social positions. However, whether religious and political authority resided in the same individuals or institutions, or remained separate, cannot be determined from archaeological evidence. Cahokia reached its maximum extent and population during the late 11th and 12th centuries CE. Population estimates for this period vary substantially among researchers, ranging from 10,000 to 40,000 individuals. The variation in estimates reflects differences in methodology, assumptions about household size, and uncertainty about the proportion of the site occupied simultaneously. Archaeological surveys have documented thousands of house locations, but determining which structures were contemporaneous versus sequential occupations over decades remains challenging. Most researchers accept estimates in the range of 10 to 20,000 people residing within the core urban area at peak occupation. The geographic extent of peak settlement covered approximately 13 square kilometers within and immediately surrounding the central palisaded area. Residential structures extended across this zone with varying density. Some neighborhoods showed closely spaced houses, while others had more dispersed settlement. The overall settlement pattern suggests planned organization rather than organic growth, with structures aligned along common orientations and open spaces maintained between residential clusters. This level of planning implies centralized authority, capable of directing settlement layout and enforcing spatial organization. Population concentration at Cahokia drew people from surrounding regions, depopulating smaller settlements across portions of the American bottom. Archaeological surveys show that many sites occupied during earlier periods were abandoned as Cahokia grew. Whether this depopulation resulted from voluntary migration, coerced relocation, or other factors remains debated. The concentration of population created logistical challenges, including waste disposal, water supply, and conflict management that required organizational solutions beyond those needed in smaller dispersed communities. Regional influence during Cahokia's peak extended along the Mississippi River Valley and into adjacent drainages. Sites located hundreds of kilometers from Cahokia show evidence of Mississippian cultural traits, including platform mound construction, shell-tempered pottery, and intensified maize agriculture. The relationship between these distant sites and Cahokia varied by region. Some appear to have been established by migrants from the American bottom, carrying architectural and ceramic traditions to new locations. Others may have adopted Mississippian practices through emulation or participation in exchange networks without direct population movement. Satellite communities in the immediate American Bottom region numbered in the dozens based on archaeological survey data. These sites ranged from single mound centers with associated villages to dispersed farmsteads without monumental architecture. The distribution of these settlements suggests territorial organization, with satellite centers spaced at relatively regular intervals around Cahokia. Whether these sites functioned as administrative centers controlling local populations, autonomous communities allied with Cahokia, or resource extraction localities remains uncertain. Limited excavation at most satellite sites restricts interpretation of their specific functions and relationships to the central city. The presence of Cahokia-style artifacts at distant sites indicates either export from Cahokia or adoption of Cahokian manufacturing traditions. Ramey incised pottery, characterized by distinctive decorative motifs, appears at sites across the Mississippian world. This pottery type originated at Cahokia, but was produced elsewhere as well, complicating efforts to trace specific exchange routes. Similarly, shell beads manufactured using techniques developed at Cahokia appear broadly, though distinguishing Cahokian exports from local production using Cahokian methods requires detailed technical analysis often not performed on older collections. Exchange networks during Cahokia's peak brought materials into the site from across eastern North America and redistributed goods outward to distant communities. Marine shell from both Gulf Coast and Atlantic sources arrived at Cahokia and was manufactured into beads, gorgets, and other items. Some finished products remained at Cahokia, while others moved to satellite sites or more distant locations. Copper objects manufactured at Cahokia similarly entered exchange networks, appearing at sites throughout the Mississippi Valley. The scale of this exchange suggests specialized traders or institutionalized exchange systems rather than casual opportunistic trade. Religious or ceremonial connections may have drawn people to Cahokia from distant regions. The site's scale and elaborate architecture could have functioned as a pilgrimage destination or ceremonial center hosting periodic gatherings. Ethnographic accounts from historic period Native American societies describe ceremonial centers that attracted participants from wide areas for specific events. Whether Cahokia served similar functions cannot be confirmed archaeologically, but the presence of artifacts from diverse regions and evidence of large-scale feasting suggest that communal gatherings occurred. The capacity of the Grand Plaza to accommodate thousands of people supports interpretations emphasizing ceremonial or political gatherings. Competition between Cahokia and other major Mississippian centers remains difficult to assess archaeologically. Moundville in Alabama and Etowah in Georgia emerged as significant centers during the same general period as Cahokia's florescence. Whether these centers competed for control of exchange routes, populations, or ideological influence, or whether they coexisted without significant interaction, cannot be determined from available evidence. The geographic distances between major centers may have prevented direct competition, allowing multiple centers to flourish simultaneously in different regions. Agricultural intensification supported Cahokia's large population, but also created vulnerabilities. Dependence on maize cultivation made populations susceptible to crop failures from drought, flooding, or pest infestations. The concentration of people in a limited area increased disease transmission risks and required coordination of waste disposal to prevent contamination of water supplies. Archaeological evidence of declining health in skeletal populations during Cahokia's peak suggests that urban living conditions created stresses affecting nutrition and disease exposure. Craft production intensified to meet demands for prestige goods, utilitarian objects, and materials for exchange. The scale of shell bead production during Cahokia's peak exceeded earlier periods by orders of magnitude. Millions of shell beads entered circulation, serving as grave goods, ornaments, and possibly currency. The labor investment in bead production was substantial, requiring procurement of raw materials, manufacturing, and distribution systems. Whether this production served primarily internal Cahokian needs or external exchange remains debated. Monumental construction continued during the peak period with expansion and modification of existing mounds and construction of new features. Monk's Mound received additional building episodes, increasing its height and modifying terrace configurations. New platform mounds were constructed in various portions of the site. The sustained investment in monumental architecture during the peak suggests that elites maintained authority to mobilize labor even as population reached maximum levels. Whether labor mobilization became more difficult as populations grew, requiring greater inducements or coercion, cannot be determined archaeologically. The duration of Cahokia's peak occupation remains uncertain due to limitations in archaeological dating methods. Radiocarbon dates provide age ranges spanning decades or centuries, making it difficult to determine how long maximum population levels persisted. Some researchers suggest that the peak lasted only a few generations, while others propose sustained high population for a century or more. The resolution of this question has implications for understanding Cahokia's political stability and the sustainability of urban life at this scale in prehistoric North America. Evidence of environmental degradation appears during the peak period. Deforestation reduced tree cover, potentially requiring longer-distance timber procurement for construction and fuel. Soil erosion increased as agricultural fields expanded onto marginal lands. Game animal populations may have declined due to intensive hunting. These environmental changes could have created feedback loops undermining the resource base supporting large populations, though the severity and timing of such effects remain debated. The relationship between Cahokia's peak and the medieval warm period creates questions about environmental enablement of social complexity. The favorable climate conditions during this period supported agricultural productivity and reduced subsistence risks. Whether Cahokia could have achieved comparable scale under less favorable climatic conditions remains speculative. The subsequent decline of Cahokia during the transition to cooler conditions suggests possible climate sensitivity, though social and political factors complicate simple environmental determinism. Population at Cahokia began declining sometime during the 13th century CE, though the precise timing and pace of depopulation remain debated. Archaeological evidence shows that portions of the site were abandoned while others continued to be occupied, suggesting gradual rather than sudden depopulation. Radiocarbon dates from residential areas and mounds indicate that occupation contracted spatially over time, with peripheral neighborhoods abandoned first and the central precinct maintained longer. By approximately 1350 CE, most of the site appears to have been abandoned, though limited occupation may have continued in reduced form. The causes of Cahokia's decline have generated extensive debate among archaeologists. Environmental explanations emphasize resource depletion, soil exhaustion, climate deterioration, and ecological degradation. Social explanations focus on political instability, warfare, factional conflict, and the breakdown of authority structures. Economic models propose that exchange network disruptions, competition from rival centers, or agricultural intensification limits undermined the city's viability. Multiple factors likely contributed, rather than a single cause explaining the decline, though researchers disagree about the relative importance of different variables. Evidence of environmental stress during the decline period includes deforestation, soil erosion, and shifts in faunal exploitation patterns. Analysis of archaeological deposits shows increasing reliance on smaller game animals and fish compared to earlier periods when deer dominated meat sources. This shift suggests that deer populations declined due to overhunting or habitat loss, forcing hunters to pursue alternative prey. Similarly, changes in mussel shell assemblages indicate exploitation of smaller individuals and less preferred species, consistent with overharvesting of mollusk populations. Climate change during the late 13th and early 14th centuries involved transition from the medieval warm period to cooler conditions. Tree ring records from the broader region show evidence of droughts and increased climate variability during this period. Shorter growing seasons and more frequent crop failures could have undermined agricultural productivity and created subsistence stress. However, linking specific climate events to Cahokia's abandonment remains problematic due to dating uncertainties and the difficulty of demonstrating direct causation rather than correlation. Political instability may have contributed to decline through loss of centralized authority and inability to coordinate labor or redistribute resources. The breakdown of elite power could have resulted from internal factional conflicts, challenges to leadership legitimacy, or failure to manage subsistence crises effectively. Archaeological evidence for political instability remains indirect, inferred from changes in settlement patterns, cessation of mound construction, and possible increases in violence. Whether political collapse caused abandonment or resulted from other stresses that also drove depopulation cannot be determined definitively. Evidence of increased violence appears during the late occupation period at some sites in the American bottom. Skeletal remains show higher frequencies of trauma, and some settlements exhibit evidence of burning or destruction. However, whether violence increased substantially or remained at levels comparable to earlier periods remains uncertain due to limited skeletal samples. The construction and maintenance of palisade fortifications throughout much of Cahokia's occupation suggests that defense concerns persisted across multiple periods rather than emerging solely during decline. Population dispersal from Cahokia may have involved migration to other regions rather than simple demographic collapse. Some researchers propose that Cahokians relocated to other Mississippian centers or established new communities elsewhere. Tracing such migrations archaeologically requires identifying Cahokian material culture at distant sites and demonstrating temporal relationships consistent with emigration during Cahokia's decline. Limited evidence exists for substantial Cahokian migration to specific destinations, leaving the fate of Cahokia's population largely unknown. The abandonment process appears to have been gradual based on spatial patterns of occupation. Outlying residential areas show earlier abandonment than central zones. Mound construction ceased before complete site abandonment, suggesting that elites lost the capacity to mobilize labor before populations departed entirely. Structures in some areas show evidence of planned dismantlement, with posts removed and materials salvaged, indicating organized departure rather than panicked flight. Other areas contain structures that appear to have been abandoned without salvage, suggesting variable circumstances of departure. Regional settlement patterns change during and after Cahokia's decline. Some satellite communities persisted after the central city was abandoned, suggesting that depopulation did not affect the entire American bottom uniformly. Other areas show evidence of new settlements appearing during the late prehistoric period, indicating continued but reorganized occupation. The overall pattern suggests transformation of settlement systems rather than complete regional abandonment, though population levels remained substantially lower than during Cahokia's peak. Alternative explanations for decline emphasize social factors, including ideological change or loss of religious legitimacy. If Cahokia's authority derived partly from religious or ceremonial roles, failure of predicted events, inability to perform essential rituals, or challenges to cosmological beliefs could have undermined elite power. Archaeological evidence for ideological change remains limited to shifts in iconography or burial practices, which could reflect multiple causes. The specific mechanisms by which religious authority might have eroded cannot be determined from material remains. Economic explanations for decline focus on the sustainability of exchange networks and craft production systems. If Cahokia's economy depended on controlling exchange routes or producing specialized goods for export, competition from rival centers or disruption of trade networks could have undermined the economic base supporting urban populations. Evidence for economic disruption includes declining quantities of exotic materials in late contexts and reduced evidence of specialized craft production. However, whether economic problems caused decline or resulted from population loss and political instability remains uncertain. The comparative sustainability of urban life at Cahokia's scale represents a key question. No other prehistoric North American site north of Mexico achieved comparable population concentration, suggesting that sustaining such populations required exceptional conditions or organizational capabilities. Whether Cahokia's decline reflects inherent limits to urban life at this latitude and technological level, or whether specific historical circumstances caused abandonment that might have been avoided under different conditions, remains debated. The lack of comparable cases limits comparative analysis. Epidemics represent another potential cause of population decline, though direct evidence for disease outbreaks remains absent. Concentrated populations face elevated disease transmission risks, particularly for infectious diseases spread through person-to-person contact or contaminated water. Skeletal evidence shows various pathologies in Cahokian populations, but distinguishing endemic conditions from epidemic diseases requires careful analysis. The absence of mass graves containing individuals dying simultaneously limits evidence for catastrophic epidemics, though such events could have occurred without leaving distinctive archaeological signatures. The relationship between Cahokia's decline and changes at other Mississippian centers complicates single-site explanations. Some major centers, including Moundville, continued to be occupied, or even expanded during the period when Cahokia declined. Other sites also experienced abandonment during the 13th and 14th centuries. This variation suggests that some factors affecting Cahokia were local or regional rather than continent-wide, though broader climate changes or economic disruptions could have affected different regions differently. The final occupation at Cahokia remains poorly documented archaeologically. Limited excavation of late contexts and dating uncertainties prevent detailed reconstruction of the abandonment process. Whether a small population persisted at the site after major abandonment, using the landscape seasonally, or maintaining specific ceremonial functions, cannot be determined from available evidence. Early historic period accounts do not mention Cahokia, suggesting that by European contact the site was no longer an important settlement, though native peoples undoubtedly knew of and possibly visited the mounds. The abandonment of Cahokia represents one of the most significant demographic and political transformations in prehistoric North American history. The dispersal of what had been the continent's largest urban population and the cessation of monumental construction at this scale marked the end of a distinctive social and political formation. Understanding why this abandonment occurred remains one of the central questions in North American archaeology, with implications for assessing the sustainability of complex societies, the role of environmental factors in social change, and the diversity of trajectories human societies can follow. Archaeological investigation of Cahokia began in the 19th century, though early work consisted primarily of amateur excavation and artifact collecting rather than systematic research. The large earthen mounds attracted attention from settlers and scholars who recognized them as products of human construction. Early interpretations often attributed the mounds to vanished civilizations unrelated to Native Americans, reflecting racist assumptions prevalent during that period. Systematic archaeological research did not begin until the early 20th century, and large-scale scientific excavation commenced primarily after the mid-20th century. The Cahokia site faced substantial destruction from agricultural activity, urban development, and highway construction before preservation efforts began. Plowing leveled many smaller mounds and damaged portions of larger structures. The construction of U.S. Highway 40 through the site in the 1920s destroyed archaeological deposits and bisected the central precinct. Residential and commercial development eliminated entire neighborhoods of the prehistoric city. Modern Collinsville, Illinois, occupies portions of the ancient settlement. Estimates suggest that more than half of the original mounds were destroyed before systematic documentation occurred. Early excavations at Cahokia focused on mound interiors, seeking elaborate burials and prestige artifacts. Excavators tunneled into mounds, rather than excavating systematically in layers, destroying stratigraphic information and context. The focus on artifact recovery, rather than understanding site formation processes and settlement organization, limited the scientific value of early work. Many artifacts recovered during this period lack precise provenience information, making them difficult to incorporate into modern analyses. The loss of contextual information represents an irreplaceable research cost. Systematic archaeological research intensified during the 1960s and 1970s as highway construction threatened additional portions of the site. Salvage archaeology ahead of Interstate 55 to 70 construction documented extensive residential areas and led to the excavation of Mound 72 with its extraordinary burials. These projects established Cahokia's scale and complexity, demonstrating that the site represented a major urban center rather than simply a ceremonial complex. The data recovered during this period continues to inform interpretations decades later. The establishment of Cahokia Mound State Historic Site in 1925 and its expansion over subsequent decades preserved significant portions of the central precinct. The site achieved National Historic Landmark status in 1964 and became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982, recognizing its global significance. These designations provided protection from development and supported funding for research and preservation. However, portions of the prehistoric city extend beyond protected boundaries, remaining vulnerable to destruction from development or agricultural activity. Archaeological survey using remote sensing technologies, including magnetometry, ground-penetrating radar, and LiDAR, has revealed features invisible on the surface. These techniques identify buried structures, palisade lines, and mound remnants without excavation. Survey data show that settlement extended more broadly than previously recognized, and that landscape modifications, including borrow pits, plazas, and earthworks, were more extensive than earlier estimates suggested. The application of these technologies continues to revise understanding of Cahokia's extent and organization. Excavation strategies at Cahokia have shifted from mound-focused work to broader investigations of residential areas, craft production zones, and peripheral settlements. Recent projects examine neighborhoods to understand daily life, household organization, and economic activities. These excavations reveal diversity in residential patterns, craft specialization, and access to resources. The emphasis on household archaeology complements earlier work focused on monumental architecture and elite contexts, providing more comprehensive understanding of Cahokian society. Chronological refinement through improved radiocarbon dating and Bayesian statistical modeling has clarified the timing of Cahokia's emergence, peak, and decline. Earlier interpretations relied on broader chronological frameworks that obscured rapid changes and short-term events. Recent work demonstrates that Cahokia's transformation from one settlement among many to the dominant center occurred within a few generations rather than gradually over centuries. Similarly, the decline appears more protracted than previously thought, with abandonment occurring over a century or more, rather than catastrophically. Skeletal analysis from Cahokia and surrounding sites provides information about health, nutrition, violence, and population origins. Bioarchaeological studies examine patterns of trauma, disease, and nutritional stress across different social groups and time periods. Stable isotope analysis reveals dietary patterns and migration histories. DNA analysis, still in early stages for Cahokia materials, offers potential to trace population movements and genetic relationships. These biological data complement artifact-based studies, providing perspectives on human experiences not accessible through material culture alone. Preservation challenges continue to threaten the site. Monk's Mound experienced significant slumping on its western face, requiring stabilization efforts to prevent collapse. Erosion affects other mounds and archaeological deposits. Vegetation management, drainage, and visitor impact all create ongoing preservation concerns. The scale of the site makes comprehensive preservation expensive and logistically challenging. Balancing public access with protection of archaeological resources requires careful management. Interpretive challenges at Cahokia include the absence of written records and the limited applicability of ethnographic analogy. Historic period Native American societies differed substantially from Cahokia, having experienced centuries of change and the catastrophic impacts of European contact. Using ethnographic data to interpret Cahokia requires caution, as projecting recent practices onto a society separated by centuries risks anachronism. Archaeological interpretation must rely primarily on material evidence, limiting access to social organization, beliefs, and practices that leave minimal material traces. Collaboration with contemporary Native American communities represents an important component of modern Cahokia research and interpretation. Multiple tribal nations, including the Osage Nation and others, trace connections to the region and view Cahokia as part of their heritage. Consultation with tribal representatives informs research priorities, interpretation, and treatment of human remains and sacred objects. This collaboration recognizes that Cahokia's significance extends beyond academic archaeology to encompass living cultural heritage. Unresolved questions about Cahokia remain numerous despite decades of research. The specific political organization, whether chiefdom, state, or some other form, remains debated. The mechanisms that enabled rapid population concentration and sustained urban life for centuries remain incompletely understood. The relationship between Cahokia and other Mississippian centers, whether hierarchical or peer-based, continues to generate discussion. The causes of decline and the fate of Cahokia's population after abandonment remain uncertain. These questions drive ongoing research. Comparative perspectives position Cahokia within global contexts of urbanism and social complexity. As the largest prehistoric city north of Mexico, Cahokia represents an independent development of urban life, comparable in some respects to early cities in other world regions. However, Cahokia differed from many Old World cities in lacking wheeled vehicles, draft animals, writing systems, and metallurgy beyond cold hammering of copper. These differences raise questions about the necessary conditions for urbanism and the diversity of pathways to social complexity. Public interpretation at Cahokia Mound State Historic Site presents the site to hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. The interpretive center includes exhibits, reconstructed structures, and educational programs. Balancing scientific accuracy with accessibility for general audiences creates interpretive challenges. Avoiding romanticization while conveying the significance and achievements of Cahokian society requires careful presentation. Public interpretation also provides opportunities to address misconceptions about prehistoric North America and Native American history. The future of Cahokia research depends on continued preservation, funding for investigation, and development of new analytical techniques. Portions of the site remain unexcavated, representing reserves for future research when improved methods allow more information to be extracted from limited excavation. Non-invasive investigation through remote sensing and geophysical survey will continue to reveal buried features. Reanalysis of museum collections using new techniques provides ongoing research opportunities without additional excavation. The combination of preserved archaeological deposits, museum collections, and developing analytical methods ensures that Cahokia will continue to yield new information for decades to come.